What is up, guys? Welcome to episode 68 of the Triage Method podcast. I'm back in lovely, overcast Ireland. Paddy, still in America. How are you this week, Paddy?
Absolutely, positively fantastic. We tried to record this the other day. Gary slept in, first of all. Disgusting.
By 3 minutes.
Disgusting, regardless. Uh, and then his internet was awful. So that's why today's podcast is a little bit later than usual. Hopefully, I'm going to get it up today. So it'll still be on the same day. At least it's the same day for me. So that's all that matters, isn't it?
Yeah.
But yeah, so today's podcast, we are basically going to do a Q&A one because we've been getting a good few questions in, and there's a few ones here that are good in terms of they allow us to cover a few different variables, a few different things. But also, we really appreciate it when people actually submit questions because it actually allows us to answer your questions, as crazy as that sounds. But yeah, like obviously we come up with topics maybe we're thinking about, topics we maybe think or have been asked about in real person or in real life. But it does always help us to come up with topics if you actually ask questions, if you actually guide the process and actually, tell us what you need help with, because us just coming up with random topics, yeah, that obviously helps, but maybe it's not the answer, or it doesn't provide you with the answers to the questions you want answers to. So there is a form in the description box if you want to submit your questions, and I do suggest you do, even if you think it is a pretty stupid question, or even if it's a very specific question, it does allow us to talk to a broader audience, answer a broader audience, even if the question is specific. Because like, as much as we all want to think we're unique snowflakes and whatever else, like more often than not, you're just not. Someone else is going to have the same issue, someone else is going to have the same problem, someone else is going to have the same circumstances, everything. And providing you with an answer thus provides them with an answer. But anyway, Gary, will we get cracking on with this Q&A?
Yeah, so to give some context, these questions are essentially a mix of those from our Facebook community, which we really recommend that you join. That's the easiest way to have like comprehensive contact with us because we can actually answer questions in depth there. We're hoping to kind of reduce the amount that we use Instagram. So our Facebook community, that's the place to be. If you're not there, get involved. That'll be linked in the description box below as well. So get on that. So yeah, these questions will come in from you guys, and we're going to work through them one by one. And as Paddy said, if you have questions in the future, do submit them. So the first question was, is the chest press okay for building my chest? I prefer it to the bench press. And this was actually from one of my clients who kind of asked this personally. So this is a question that I got via email. And the reason he essentially asked this is because I've actually been programming this for him, and he's essentially found that he much prefers this exercise, gets a lot more out of it, feels like he can push himself a lot more versus the bench press. And yeah, that was essentially his question. And I suppose, like, before we get into this, I think it's worth noting that the answer to this question can apply to a wide variety of exercises. It's not just about the chest press versus the bench press. It's more so kind of a fundamental, like, conceptual understanding of exercise that's often missing. So, one thing we always talk about, Paddy, is the idea that most people these days, in terms of getting their health and fitness education, they tend to get it from social media. Whether that doesn't just mean Instagram, it can also be Facebook, it can even be YouTube. And you can get valuable information on those platforms, but very often it's meant to give you sound bites. It's meant to give you things that are, immediately implementable, that seem like attractive. They're attractive ideas, but they're not often giving you like the foundational subjects that are important for understanding.
It's superficial information. It's like,
yeah,
the surface level thing. If you grasp this, you've grasped the concept. Like, you understand the basics in terms of, oh yeah, like these exercises work these muscles, and you do these consistently in whatever rep range, you build muscle. You understand that, but you don't understand the underlying concepts. You don't understand the kind of why behind that. You maybe just understand the how, which in itself is helpful, but it kind of leads to, like you said, these sound bites. It's like, oh, do lunges for this, do squats for this, you must bench press. And it's like, you can't argue from first principles for that statement. I think that's kind of what's missing a lot of the time. But anyway, sorry for interrupting.
Yeah, and like it goes for all exercises, and I suppose like one of the things that we're trying to do currently and in the future is trying to get to the point where we've laid out all the foundational stuff that people kind of need to know to understand exercise, but we're also giving you almost like the soundbite stuff in that, like, here's what a chest press looks like, here's what a bench press looks like, here's what a dumbbell bench press looks like, etc. Like, you can look at all those tools and appreciate them in a non-judgmental way, in that, like, you don't, for someone to put out in advice about exercise, it doesn't have to be like, this is the one best exercise, because to be fair, you can make a strong argument for lots of exercises being better than lots of other exercises. There is a spectrum there is a hierarchy, but that doesn't mean we have to ignore other exercises because of that. But anyway, to get to the crux of this question, so essentially, like, where we start off with this is asking the question, what is it exactly that leads to the chest muscles needing to work during a bench press or during any sort of horizontal pressing exercise? And that is essentially, it's easier for those of you who are watching this on YouTube, obviously, but that is essentially some sort of force that's acting on my arm to try and push me down. Okay, so there's some sort of force that's trying to push my shoulder joint into that extended position or horizontal extension, which can be at varying degrees of horizontal or of abduction, like that. So the arm moving up and down, and essentially, like that relates to, whether if your elbows are up really high, that you can still be challenged. If your elbows are down lower, you can still be challenged, because there's some way that pec can pull on that shoulder joint and apply a force. So essentially, what you've got is some sort of challenge on the shoulder joint that is trying to push against the path of motion that pec, that chest muscle, can pull. Okay, so that's a really simple way of looking at it. If you want more detail on that, of course, go to our articles on anatomy and biomechanics and you'll get a better idea of what that stuff means technically. But that's essentially what we're looking for. We're looking for some sort of force that is opposing the movement of the shoulder that the chest muscles will create. Okay, so when we're doing some sort of chest pressing or horizontal pressing movement, the fact that it's a barbell doesn't really matter. All your chest muscles are essentially, quote unquote, sensing is the fact that they're producing sufficient tension to move that shoulder joint. Okay, the fact that it's a barbell or a dumbbell or a chest press, it kind of doesn't really matter. But at the same time, it does matter, because those different exercises have to have different qualities. So in this case, like, I think it's useful to at least try and explain why someone might feel that their chest is maybe being better stimulated on a chest press versus a bench press. So in this case, what could be going on is that, let's say, when someone uses the chest press, what they might be doing is potentially working through a smaller range of motion. Like that can happen sometimes. Like, if sometimes when some people have, let's say, really long arms or really kind of shallow rib cage, depending on where they're gripping the bar, they might find that when they come down to that real low bottom position, that it's a bit uncomfortable in their shoulders and they don't feel like their chest is being stimulated as best as possible. So that could be one reason. It could be a difference in the range of motion that the person's using. Another difference could be the grip width or the angle of the grip that someone's using. So, you could have maybe a narrower grip on the chest press. You could have a converging chest press, which means that it's wider at the bottom and it's narrower at the top. And what that would then mean is that when you're moving from narrower to wider, it means that your shoulder is actually working through a larger range of motion. And that's the really interesting thing about discussions of range of motion a lot of the time. People talk about full range of motion, but if you look at the quote unquote full range of motion of a normal bench press, you're actually still not even getting to that point where your chest muscles would actually be shortened, and that doesn't mean you have to, but I mean, it just means that you have to look at range of motion at both ends of the exercise. So you could have someone that's using less of the end range of the chest and more of the short range of the chest during a chest press when it's converging. So again, that's another qualitative and quantitative difference of that exercise. So it'll change the experience. And then the final one, go ahead.
Before you go on, and on that, like, this is, again, if you can understand what Gary just said there, like, you actually will understand a lot of exercise selection, because this whole concept of range of motion is obviously important. This is why people talk about it, but it is one of these kind of bastardized concepts, right? And this is, if you understand that, you'll understand why talking about this stuff in terms of like, oh, should I do a bench press or a chest press? It kind of becomes irrelevant, because what you start thinking of is like, what am I actually trying to achieve for this muscle, or in this muscle, I suppose, for this exercise. And like, you could see something like this converging chest press that perfectly fits your specific mechanics, you know, and it could actually take you through almost full range of motion of your chest fibers, and also be an appropriate load depending on the way the cables are set up, or whatever the fuck, the way the machine, the cam is set up. It could be an appropriate load throughout every single point of that range of motion. The discussion between, is that a better exercise than the bench press, is obviously going to be hugely different. And you'll see this, which is really quite interesting, in people that do say like, oh, you must bench press. They'll then say like, oh, well, I use like dumbbell bench press as well because I get a better contraction of the chest. And you're like, okay, well, let's actually discuss that. If you're then going to make this argument that the bench press is the best mass builder, and then say it's because there's a range of motion, or because it's a compound exercise, and then you are like, oh, well, I actually need these other exercises to ensure that my chest is appropriately stimulated. You know, they might go like, oh, you bench press, then you dumbbell bench press, and then you do some sort of fly, because that gets all of the chest fibers activated or something. I don't know, you know? It's like, if you like think about what you're actually trying to achieve, like, would it be better? And this also bleeds into the other arguments around like volume and stuff, you know, like the discussion of like an exercise or a training program that has adequate volume for each given portion of the muscle, versus like, say you did that over 9 sets. You did, okay, we're going to get the chest into like, we'll say a mid-range position, and we're going to get the chest into a kind of fully contracted position, and then we're going to get the chest into a stretch position. And you use 3 different exercises for that, for example. So we'll say you use the bench press, you use a cable fly, you know, maybe even cuffed at the elbows, and then you use some sort of like dumbbell fly, right? And you're like, yeah, I brought the chest through all of its ranges of motion and really adequately stimulated. Like, you say you took 9 sets to do that. What if you did that in 3 sets with a chest press machine that was perfectly designed, and it stimulated all of those ranges of motion in 3 sets? That's obviously a completely different discussion, which obviously gets lost in the overall grand scheme of things when you're discussing all this stuff, you know? So if you can kind of understand what Gary was just saying there, and really let that kind of permeate and percolate in your mind, you will understand a lot about training as a whole.
Yeah, because like you're saying, it's just not as black and white as people kind of like to make out, because everyone talks about like the overall quantification essentially of the stimulus, and that like we're trying to quantify exactly what the training stimulus is, but very often it's very macro in that like we're talking about volume, like, all right, how many sets did you do? But very often like the micro is totally ignored, and obviously like your goal at the start should be to maximize the micro, because you want to get as much out of like each repetition and each set as possible before you worry about how many sets you do. Like that's kind of common sense in any area of life, and that like you're going to study for 8 hours, you'd want to make sure you could do like 1 good hour first before you did 8, and then you want to see how the quality changed as you add more hours, because like it's important stuff. So that's important to keep into the discussion when it comes to all training principles. But to get back to the question, the final thing that essentially could be changing here, and you mentioned it, as it relates to a chest press versus a bench press, is that the way in which that resistance is applied throughout the range of motion could just be different. Okay, so generally what you'll find in lots of chest press machines is that, like well-designed ones, it might be there'll be a little bit of a drop-off at the end as you get into that position where you're maybe not quite as strong, and then at the top it'll start to increase. Okay, so the resistance will increase a little bit, and generally that tends to come with a stronger sensation of chest contraction, because in the top range when you're shortened, and also because you're able to keep a bit more control throughout the range of motion. So overall, there can be a number of different reasons why someone would experience, you know, a different sensation or a different feeling, or feel like they're getting stronger more in a chest press. And essentially what we're saying is that like all of these exercises work, and that if you feel like a chest press is better for you, by all means go ahead and use it. The same goes for a leg press or a hack squat. or a seated row machine. You know, people often just assume that there has to be something inherent to barbells or dumbbells that make them more anabolic, whereas it's far more likely that it's because of accessibility. Most trainees tend to use them because they're always accessible, and also kind of path dependence. And when I say path dependence, I mean that something that has been done in the past is far more likely to be done currently. Okay, so if all the greatest lifters over time, especially when there was less machines, have used barbells and dumbbells, especially when they're related to different sports like weightlifting and powerlifting, we should expect by default that most of the biggest and strongest guys would use free weights. But the problem is that association is often made out to be causal by most people who say, "Oh, well, look at all the great squatters; they have big legs." It's like that again is like surface level knowledge or discussion, like you mentioned at the start. So yeah,
it's also not true at all. So like it's a false statement. Like there's loads of squatters that have shit legs, like actually like shit, like skinny legs,
like you,
like me. But like proper, like for me, a back squat, it is a back exercise. Like all I feel is my erectors and my glutes, you know? And that's a high bar squat, you know. And I'm pretty good at it, you know. But you also see people who are actually like power lifters, they have shit quads, you know. Like you look at any of the Louis Simmons guys, you know, like obviously some of them have fucking juicy as fuck quads, but they squat in a really like powerlifting manner, and they literally just sit back, and they're like, oh, quads are for bodybuilders, they're for pussies. You know, they're like, oh, fuck off with that shit. So if you say like, oh, fucking squats are a great mass builder for the quads, it's like, well, like, first of all, we have to discuss what type of squat we're doing. Second of all, we have to discuss like your actual individual mechanics. And then we have to discuss the fact that training stimuli are not the same for everyone, you know? So the statement itself is just factually incorrect. And that's across time. Like you look at like any of those people that used to do that, what's that, Steinburn squat? I can't remember. You know, where they're like literally put the barbell on its side and then it comes down.
Oh yeah.
You look at all those squatters, like some of the best ones, like that's how you originally started squatting. Like they didn't used to have racks, you know. And you look at some of those squatters, some of the best ones have literally the skinniest legs I've ever seen in my life. They look like marathon runners, you know. So it's like, okay, well, maybe there's something to it. You see people as well being like, oh, deadlifts are great mass builders. And you see people pulling like 400 kilos and they're skinny as fuck, you know? So it's like there's no, the statements people make about these things are easily proven wrong, you know? So, but then it's actually quite funny because people always then make the thing be like, oh, well, those are outliers. And it's like, how can you say that and then say the exact opposite when it's your state, or like not agree with that same statement when it's your statement? If you go, oh, all the best squatters have juicy legs, and it's like, okay, well, here's people that don't. Oh, they're all outliers. And you're like, well, all of your people that are squatting with juicy legs are all outliers because the vast majority of people don't get juicy legs from squatting and also don't squat, you know? So it's like this whole thought process is easily taken apart.
Yeah, but the problem is that like it's so hard to have these discussions without the listeners, people listening to the podcast. Like I know people that listen to our podcast wouldn't do this, but most people like they want to put you in a camp once you start making these points. And someone made this argument with me before where I was talking about like the benefits of using machines and how in some cases like they can be better than free weights. And then someone said that this goes against all your advice because you say that like barbell hip thrusts are better for building glutes than glute kickbacks when you're giving advice to females. I'm like how does this, like you're just taking one point and taking it totally out of context. Like this doesn't mean that we are anti barbells. Like most of my training most of the time is barbell related, you know. Same with yours. Like you love barbell lifts, you love squatting, and we love these exercises. But so it doesn't just mean that we are the machine guys. Like all I care about is how we apply force to people and how we modify that so people get results. That's all that matters. Like we don't have camps. It's the same with diet though. Like I mean, I read lots of posts from people who are very pro like the consumption of animal-based foods, and I'm like, oh yeah, savage points. And then I follow some other people who are like big into like plant-based diets, and they make some solid points, and I'm like, yeah, good stuff, because you can find good information on both sides of the aisle. It's just when you go to the extremes that things get, I was going to say problematic there, jeepers. that problems start to present themselves. But yeah, you can use machines and you can use barbells, believe it or not, and say that they're both useful. And you can also eat plenty of meat and eggs, and you can eat plenty of mixed salads, and also, just be like, I like both. You won't have to be part of a cult, but that's okay. But anyway, the next question was, should I increase carbs?
Finish that question, right? So when you discuss all of that stuff as well, with whether you should choose a bench press or whether you should choose a chest press machine, you also have to consider what is the actual goal. Because if you are a power lifter,
yeah,
like obviously you're going to have to use the bench press.
Yes.
That doesn't mean that you always have to use it. Maybe you're like, okay, my chest is actually weak. I'm not getting an adequate stimulus from this. I'm going to use a chest press to get more volume on my chest and actually build up the muscles there. So, I can decrease the range of motion that I'm doing on the bench press because my chest is fucking thick and juicy. So I need to come down less, But you need to actually discuss what you're actually trying to achieve. Because obviously we were just talking about it there in terms of Gary's client, who's obviously trying to build muscle, maybe lose fat or whatever. But if their goal is to build muscle, like all we care about is the stimulus on that muscle. But if your goal is to compete in a sport that requires you to bench press, you're going to need to bench press. Like it's pretty straightforward, like there's no real way around that. So yeah, you need to consider the individual themselves.
Yup. And then the next question, onto the nutrition side of things. Should I increase carbohydrates or fats when gaining, i.e. in a calorie surplus with the aim of building muscle and presumably not gaining that much fat? What do we think?
Personally, looking at the scientific literature, whatever, carbohydrates are going to give you the best bang for your buck in terms of both performance and gaining potential. Okay? Fats, I just look at them as once you're kind of past that 0.6 to 1 gram per kilo, like once you're in that kind of range, you're pretty good to go. Like there are maybe potential benefits for the lower end or the higher end or even above that for certain populations. But that's kind of a more specific circumstantial kind of discussion we'd need to have. Like if you're talking about someone that, I don't know, has certain genes that predispose them to not deal with fat as well. Obviously, they're going to have to consume lower fat intakes, So that would be more specific. But in terms of just generalized advice, I would definitely go for carbs. If you think about it, they also give the best bang for your buck in terms of an insulin response, right? Which is obviously something that we actually want when we are trying to gain muscle. Like we're trying to grow, and insulin is effectively looking or working as a nutrient sensor or an energy sensor in this case. So if it's a body's telling, or your body, you are eating stuff that's allowing your body to tell the rest of your body that, yeah, there's food available, growing is probably a good idea right now. That's obviously what we want. And in terms of thinking of this kind of a little bit out there, first of all, carbohydrates are going to give you the best bang for your buck in terms of your performance in the gym day to day, right? For the vast majority of people, obviously it depends on what you're doing, but for the vast majority of people, if we're talking about gaining muscle, you're going to be tapping into that kind of glycogen stuff as you are training, more so than the fat stores, purely because that's the energetics of muscle contraction, right? So carbohydrates are going to give you the most bang for your buck in terms of your performance in the gym, especially if you're doing kind of, we'll say, the 12-ish rep range, you're kind of pumping up those reps, and again, in an effort to increase overall volume, like you're just going to be tapping into those stores a little bit more. Maybe like I know some people do it like, oh well, I need all my carbohydrates for performance, and they're doing like 3 reps. It's like yeah, obviously it does help, but it's not you're not exactly tapping into any kind of anaerobic processes that would require this hugely, right? So yeah, my vote goes for carbohydrates.
Yeah, I would agree. Like, just a couple of points that I suppose, like, you can make a very strong argument for it being potentially like beneficial for muscle building and performance. We've actually discussed that like quite a bit in, like, if you go into the nutrition articles, you can read about the carbohydrate stuff, and also in the training articles and the exercise physiology, we've touched on some of the more physiological concepts as it relates to like nutrition and resistance training. So you can read more about that there. But essentially, you can make an argument that it could potentially improve performance and or recovery, which may or may not be important depending on the situation. For example, if you also play a sport while trying to gain muscle, it's probably important to have a higher carbohydrate intake in general. And then you can also make the argument that it could potentially lead to less fat gain, as in, like, there are some studies, at least in the short term, where when you overfeed with carbohydrates versus overfeeding with fat, you tend to see less fat gain. For whatever reason, could be the case that they're just initially storing the glycogen, that it causes increases in performance, or whatever the reason is. But there is some research on that. The other thing I think is more of a practical concern, in that from what I've observed in people who have preferred a higher fat approach, what tends to happen sometimes is, when you have a high calorie intake and a high fat goal, while also having, let's say, moderate carbohydrates, you can actually eat pretty much whatever you want while satisfying your macronutrients. In that, it's very easy to just be like, oh, I've got whatever 40 grams of fat left and 100 grams of carbs, so I'm going to go and get like a double cheeseburger and a dairy milk. So sometimes that is what happens, is that because there's essentially no constraint on any one macronutrient, people can sometimes make potentially worse food choices, which in small quantities, not a problem, but when they're in larger quantities, especially when in a calorie surplus, that mightn't be ideal. Okay, so food quality does matter for sure. So yeah, you can make the argument both practically and theoretically that increasing carbohydrates is probably a better idea.
100%. Also, like, I know people, it's somewhat transient, and I know people like to make a big deal out of stuff that isn't necessarily true. But speaking from a scientific point of view, the carbohydrates are going to give you more of a hormonal advantage, right? In terms of, again, like, they're signaling to your body that you have energy available, more so than you would if you had fat available, or you were eating fat, because you get a bigger insulin response. And you could make the argument that that's going to increase your testosterone more so than having more fat in the diet. But again, it gets kind of tricky, because you need a certain amount of fat for those processes, especially like cholesterol and stuff, even though it can be synthesized, for those processes to actually take place, which is really, like, it's quite funny. Like, we were talking about this earlier on, Gary, and like, I was saying that most biochemists are actually retarded. But like, it is the case, because people make these claims that, like, if you actually understood what was going on, like, under the hood, you would kind of go, oh, that actually makes a lot of sense. Like, you look at people that are insulin resistant, they actually have higher testosterone levels, right? So people are all like, oh, you need to get insulin sensitive. You need to get insulin sensitive because it's better for your health. And to a large extent, that's very true, right? But if you look at the actual research, is like, people that are insulin resistant do tend to have higher testosterone levels, just if you just compare two populations, right? And that obviously makes sense, because for every carb that they're eating, they have to secrete more insulin to get it to knock on the door to get into the cell. And again, that insulin is signaling to the body that you have energy available. So testosterone goes up, which is kind of helps to explain why testosterone generally tends to go down as you get into those really lean levels of body fat, But again, this all has to be taken in the context of, you're looking at people that are overweight, if they lose fat, generally their testosterone is going to go up, you know. But if we're talking about someone in this kind of healthy range, this kind of, we'll say 8 to 16% for guys, you know, if you're at the higher end of that, generally your testosterone is going to be a little bit higher, you know, which is something that we kind of intuitively don't think makes sense. But also you have to couch it in the terms of, like, if stuff is able to get into your cells more easily in general, that means that your testosterone itself that is circulating in your body is going to be more effective. So even if there's a lower total magnitude, it is more effective because it's actually able to get where it needs to go. So like, if you're looking into any of this kind of hormonal advantage from, oh, should I choose fats or should I choose carbohydrates? All of that stuff is just way more tricky than you initially think it would be, you know? So there's that.
Yeah, and then I suppose like the only final thing that's worth considering, which is something in that article I mentioned, that you basically kind of add on at the end because it's a useful reinforcing point, but it shouldn't be the first step you take, is that when you look at like the research that has been carried out on the most successful bodybuilders who tend to win shows and do the best and have the most muscle and that are leanest, they tend to consume more carbohydrates throughout their dieting phases than anyone else, and in their off season. So it is what it is. It's not hard evidence, but when we add it to everything else we discussed, I'm like, yeah, well, that's definitely a worthwhile talking point, you know, because we don't see all of these people who have really high fat, low carbohydrate diets doing quite as successful. But again, there's an element of path dependence there in that, like, everyone has recommended carbohydrates for quite a while, but take that for what it is in the context of everything else we said.
It's also really hard to interpret the research, like you were saying earlier on, about like, oh, people who consume more carbohydrates versus people who consume more fats in the diet. You know, they're like, oh, the people that were consuming the fats gained more body fat. But you have to take into account that, you know, the type of fat they eat does matter, because fats have somewhere between, like, calorie wise, 7 to 11 calories per gram, you know, depending on the type of fat you eat. So whereas carbohydrates, if I remember correctly, is like 3 to 5. Don't quote me on that, but I think that's roughly where it's at. So like, you could have a case where, I think about that, there's one in the difference, because we count carbs as 4 calories. So there's one in the difference either side of that, right? Whereas with fats, there's 2 in the difference, right? So you could be consuming a diet that, even though you think it's equated for calories, it's not actually. You know, if the fatty acids that you are choosing are actually 11 calories, you know, or the majority of them, you know, you're actually consuming more calories than you think you are consuming. So that, again, like, it's really hard to really get into the nitty gritty of the research, because there's so much under the hood of that kind of calories in, calories out argument, that people just kind of go, oh yeah, it didn't work for me, so see you later, you know? But yeah, basically, carbs, that's what wins, in my opinion. Once you're getting 0.6 to 1 gram per kilo, then you're good to go. For fats, sorry, yeah.
Yes, sir. Like, you could probably add on the additional caveat that, like, if someone was, let's say, overweight and insulin resistant, you might want a lower carb approach. But again, you wouldn't be gaining weight in that context anyway, so it's kind of
people say that all the time, but I also don't think that is a good strategy long term, because, like, we know higher fat diets make you more insulin resistant. So, like, that's not going to, like, it may help them transiently, but it also doesn't set them up long term for what you actually want to achieve. But that's, again, it comes down to this kind of, like, we'll call it nutritional periodization, where you're kind of like, okay, well, where are we right now? Let's make the correct decisions based on that, rather than just going like, oh, well, here's the overview thing. This applies to everyone 100% of the time. It's like, no, okay, you use that as an overview, and then you start dialing it in specifically to the population, you know, and then you start dialing in specifically to the individual.
Yes, sir. These are comprehensive. Cool. Right, this is a shorter one. Running my first 5 kilometer race this weekend. Any nutritional strategies I should be considering to optimize performance? So first things first, the thing to consider in this case is that 5 kilometers, although it may seem like it's an intensive endeavor for you at this point in time, from like an energy system or energy demand perspective, it's not that demanding in that like you wouldn't have to consider like a massive carbohydrate load in the days before for something like that. So like from my perspective, there wouldn't be anything massively that I change other than the basic recommendations that I probably give to someone who is just doing resistance training anyway. And that like if you're coming up to the race, having enough carbohydrates in the day before and potentially not training lower body would be a good idea. And then ensuring the next day that you're getting in carbohydrates before your race, as part of a complete meal, getting in your protein as well, probably 2 hours before the race. In and around there, different people have different preferences. But generally, when it comes to doing any sort of performance event, I always recommend people to stick with foods work for you, because I've had that experience in the past where people have been like, oh, all the other runners, they use like these energy bars, so I'm going to try those. And then you just feel like crap after them because you've never tried them before. Same with things like liquid carbohydrates. Never consume something before or after a performance event, before or during a performance event that you haven't had before. So they'd be the main considerations from my perspective. Like other than that, like you can obviously consider like supplementation or even just having a coffee. Like that can help as well. It can help endurance performance. Caffeine is useful. Like for a 5K and you're just doing your first one, I wouldn't be looking much further than that really, from a nutrition perspective. What do you think?
Only on top of that, I would say just make sure that you are eating at least at maintenance,
Yeah.
or in a surplus in the lead up to it. Like, don't be trying to do, which is what a lot of people do when they're like, oh, I'm going to go couch to 5K. And it's like they're eating at this severe deficit. They're like, yeah, I've been losing a kilo per week the whole time. And there's someone that weighs like 70 kilos. You're like, okay, you're in a massive deficit here, So if you are trying to have your best performance, you want to be at least eating maintenance calories so that you are, and again, at least eating maintenance for the week to 2 weeks before the event, potentially even in a surplus in the week to 2 weeks before the event. Obviously that has to be framed in terms of like running is generally a sport that favors lower body weights. So if you are overweight, maybe being 2 kilos lighter because you have spent the last 2 kilos in a deficit is going to be an advantage for you. You obviously have to weigh out the pros and cons for that. But as a general, if I was talking to anyone is in a general capacity, I would say at least maintenance calories for the week to 2 weeks beforehand, which should keep you within a kilo of the low body weight you were at if you were losing body fat up until that point. And the only thing that's being stored is muscle glycogen and water, which is only going to help your performance,
Yeah, that's actually, you mentioned a point there about like, the whole where your calories are at and stuff. And I think that's something that a lot of people who lift weights, they miss about running, in that like most people take up some sort of running as a means of burning more calories. Like a lot of people that lift, they tend to do that. They're like, oh, I want to do more cardio, summer's coming up, so I'm reducing my calories and I'm going to add in loads of running. And then they find it to be a horrible experience because they're like, oh no, I was too tired, too fatigued, couldn't recover from lower body training. But they look at it differently to how they would look at their weight training, in that they would expect performance to decrease. Like a lot of people do, we generally don't, but a lot of people would expect performance to decrease to some degree and training to be a little bit more burdensome if you're in a large calorie deficit, let's say. But when they look at they don't apply that then to their running or their cardio training. So that's something I would really encourage a lot of people to try, is that, when you're in a surplus, when you're at maintenance, when you have the ability to fuel training, give more cardio or aerobic work or whatever you want to call it, conditioning training, give it a try then, because that's when you get better. Like that's ultimately when you're actually fueling performance. You're going to get the best adaptations. You're going to make the best progress. So you should definitely view your conditioning training in a similar way that you view your resistance training. If you don't fuel it properly, it's not going to be as enjoyable and you're not going to perform or improve as well. So that's definitely worth considering.
Yeah, and like obviously that's not to say that you can't use cardio to induce a calorie deficit.
No.
Like that's perfectly fine, but you just have to have the right frame of mind or the mindset around it in terms of, you're not fueling this activity, you're actually getting into a deficit of energy because of this activity. So don't expect yourself to have this unreal performance or to notice these unreal adaptations because you're just not fueling it, Like, and this is something I really like working with any of the kind of GA clients that I have, like really pushing certain adaptations, more anaerobic, alactic as well, adaptations when we are in a surplus, when we actually have the calories to fuel that, and I know everyone who does GAT always wants to do that little bit more, but it's like, yeah, if we're going to do that, we're going to fuel that, so there has to be that trade-off. Like, you can't be doing intense training, like especially like intervals is generally what I'm using to induce those adaptations, and we can't be doing that if we're in a deficit. Like, for sure we can do that in a deficit, but you have to accept that there's going to be this little bit of a trade-off where you're not going to get the most out of these adaptations, and you essentially have to accept that you're going to just try to maintain your fitness. You might get a little bit of an increase because there are some pretty cool mitochondrial adaptations that occur when you are losing fat, like you are kind of upregulating those processes, mitochondrial biogenesis and stuff. So you might notice some really nice adaptations, especially if you're coming from an unfit position to a fitter position. But if you're already fit or generally fit and you're looking to really push the envelope with fitness, like, you need to fuel it.
Yep. And if you're like listening to Paddy and you're like, what? Lower energy, mitochondrial biogenesis, blah, blah, blah. Again, go back to those exercise physiology articles. Part 3 of Applied Energy Systems, Endurance Physiology. It's covered there in terms of like how diet and physiology interact there. So again,
we also covered it on that podcast we did on energy systems as well.
Yeah.
If you go back and listen, I think there's 2 of them. If you go back and listen to those, like, it does explain a lot, and you can kind of start getting the thought process around that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so the information's there. Go check it out. So I think that covers that question. And the next part is the next question rather, are high repetition sets, example 15 to 20 reps, effective for building muscle? So in general, yes, they are effective. Like, one of the things you see in the research is that you can essentially build muscle with more or less any repetition range. That doesn't mean that it's all qualitatively the same, and it doesn't mean that it's all as practically useful. And what I mean by that is that, most of the time people consider the hypertrophy rep range, and there is technically like a range that is probably most useful for hypertrophy most of the time. It's probably somewhere between 6 and 15 repetitions, but it's more like a spectrum than it is like a hard cutoff point. In that, generally what you see when people perform really low repetitions in, like, let's say less than 5 reps, people find it far more fatiguing, far more challenging. It's generally a little bit more uncomfortable. There's more fatigue related to it, and it's potentially less practical from the perspective of like setting up all the weights, potentially less practical on different exercises. Even it mightn't be as useful on all exercises. And there was another point I was going to say there. Oh yeah, potentially you could say that there might be differences in injury risk when you go to lower repetition ranges, because you're using more weight overall, and any, let's say, deviation in your technique that could fall, let's say if you fell to one side, there's more risk associated with that, or you're more difficulty racking the bar, whatever. So there's those practical considerations on that end of the spectrum. On the other end of the spectrum, there's also considerations. Go ahead.
With that as well, like, you also have to look at, like, if you consider it's not just one set that we're talking about, it's the overall workout. And we'll say, just for argument's sake, we'll say that you need to get 30 effective reps in a workout to induce hypertrophy. Like, you could, again, make that argument to be like, all right, I'm going to do 10 sets of 3. But think of like 10 sets of 3 versus, we'll say, 5 sets of 10. You're getting 50 reps with 5 sets of 10. But man, it's not nearly as fatiguing as 10 sets of 3, And I'm saying 5 sets of 10 because when you are in those lower rep ranges, like, you're pretty much getting like 100% of that muscle fiber activation. Whereas when you're in those kind of higher rep ranges, which is probably what Gary's going to go into now, you're not getting full muscle activation from the offset, So we'll say the last 5 of those reps in that 10 rep set were effective. So if you do 5 sets of 10, you're getting like 25 proper full activation reps, you know, whereas if you do 10 sets of 3, yeah, you're getting 30, but it's a lot harder, like neurologically, and also not even just neurologically, well, obviously it plays into it, but mentally, like you try going into 10 heavy sets, you know, that's a lot harder than doing 3 to 5 moderately heavy sets that are kind of 10 to 12 reps, you know?
Yeah, and like that's definitely a worthwhile part of this discussion, the kind of effective reps discussion. Like that's generally one of the reasons like less than 5 just becomes less practical, because even like let's say you did singles, you tried to do 20 singles. It's like, how practical is that? It's like, yeah, that one repetition, really potent stimulus, probably similar to, let's say, your eighth rep when you're going to failure at 8. But the thing is, what if you're doing a set of 8, you're also getting good stimulus from the 7th, good stimulus from the 6th, a bit less from the 5, not much from the 4th, nothing from the 3. You know, so that's kind of essentially the way that it works, is that the closer you get to failure, like the thing is, this is what science says now. Arnold Schwarzenegger said this. It's the reps. You know, Bruce Lee, I think, said the same thing. It's like, it's those reps when you're starting to feel the burn and it's getting really hard. They're the ones that count. And it's like, yeah, that's a bit bro sciencey, but it's true. You know, that is essentially the truth, that they're the reps that count, are those reps where you are closer to failure. That doesn't mean that going all the way to failure is necessary. And that's kind of where people kind of mix this up, is that there's probably very little difference between like 0 reps in reserve and 1 rep in reserve in terms of the stimulus, but it's very fatiguing to go all the way to maximal failure if you know how to go there, which a lot of people don't.
Most
So yeah, so yeah, essentially you've got the end of the set is generally going to be the most hypertrophic, if you want to use that word. And that's where we move on to the higher repetition ranges. For the higher repetition ranges, you can indeed gain a lot of muscle. Like if you wanted to do sets of 20, sets of 25, but it's so hard. Like it's really hard as you get to those last reps to really, you know, have the cojones to push yourself all the way to that 25th rep up with your true 25 rep max. Really difficult. And in general, all the research supports that people report far more discomfort on those higher rep sets. Even though they are building the same amount of muscle as people using, let's say, the 8 to 12 rep range. So the short and sweet of it is that you can gain muscle with all repetition ranges. It's probably most practical to use 6 to 15 a lot of the time, but also then the additional caveat is that there might be differences in the specific adaptations that you're actually getting. So obviously, if you're doing 1 to 5 reps, let's say, that's more specific to maximal strength. So you're practicing that maximal strength. Like if you're trying to improve your 1 rep max, then that's going to be more specific to that. Your 1 rep max is still technically going to be increasing if you do 8 to 12 reps, but it mightn't increase to the same degree. It might even be the case that you've increased your 12 rep max, but your 1 rep max mightn't have increased, or it might have decreased because you haven't practiced that skill in a while. So it's important to view strength as a skill. So when you get to those higher repetition ranges, again, like 20, 30 reps, there is the potential that some of that hypertrophy could potentially be quote unquote sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. Essentially what that means is that there's just there's increases in the size of the actual muscle content, but it's not coming from the myofibrillar proteins, which are your actin, your myosin. If you don't know what that is, read the Understanding Muscle Contraction article on our website. So basically what you're getting is you're getting an increase in the muscle size, but it's not necessarily coming from the proteins that are responsible for contraction. That doesn't mean that it's useless, not at all. It just means that other things are increasing in size. So that's worth considering as well. So potentially different adaptations, and that's something that's worth considering too, is that you might actually want to periodize repetition ranges over time if there are different adaptations at each level. And also if there's different practical considerations. It can make training really enjoyable to focus a bit more on, let's say, increasing your 5 rep max for a while, and then trying to, you know, increase your 20 rep max for a while. And if there's potential benefits there, I think it's a good idea to do that. Would I recommend someone goes and changes all of their repetition ranges to 15 to 20? Probably not. It's practically quite difficult. And like personally, I quite like that 6 to 15 repetition range. And I mean, if you're after the burn and you like that feeling, like slow down your repetitions and see how a hard set of 8 feels. It will feel very similar to a set of 20. And I think that's the other part of this discussion that probably gets lost, is that again, like what sort of repetition are we talking about? Are we talking about like boom, boom, down, up in a bounce? Or are we talking about like 3 seconds down, pausing for a second, 3 seconds up? Again, not saying that's better, but it's definitely different. And, different repetition ranges also have to be considered within the context of different repetition tempos, because your muscles still have to produce the energy over that period of time, and they're under tension for longer periods of time. So again, it's like we touched on in the first question, all of these things change the actual stimulus that's applied. So that all has to be kept in context.
Yeah, and I think for the vast majority of people, just getting stronger in that 6 to 15 rep range is a good idea. And if you do want to get potentially some of these adaptations, these benefits of the kind of higher rep ranges, do it on, we'll say, to finish. Like people like kind of finishers to their workouts, and that's something that I like for especially lower body, and doing like a set of, or one set of all out 25 to 30 rep Bulgarian split squats or something like that, and just really getting as much blood into the muscle as you possibly can. And like I like that at the end of the workout, because you've already gotten stronger in this kind of 6 to 15 rep range. Like you've already given the stimulus to elicit those adaptations, and you're effectively just getting as much blood into the muscle at the end of the workout. So maybe you're getting some mitochondrial biogenesis, maybe you're getting some increases in vascularization, but at the very least, you're getting blood into the muscle, which is bringing nutrients to the muscle you've just trained, So at the very least, you're getting some sort of therapeutic benefit from those kind of higher rep ranges, and being left with a really nice pump at the end of your workout, so that you've really worked hard in that workout, which is psychologically, that's very beneficial for the continued progress of actually getting to the gym. If you go to the gym and you're like, yeah, I think I worked out, but you didn't really get a pump, there was no real like mind muscle connection. You kind of feel like, did I really do anything in that session? Did it really contribute to my growth? Where if you come out of that session going, oh, Jesus, my legs, they're quivering after that. I'm really feeling that. Like psychologically, those two different states are a lot different. And that's not to say that one is better than the other. And you may find that, you do a hard set of 25 reps, you just dust and you're like, no, I hate training now. I'm giving it up, so you obviously have to take that into account. But yeah, I like the kind of higher rep stuff at the end of a workout to finish a workout just on a high note. But the vast majority, and I'm talking 90+% of your work, should be in that kind of 6 to 15 rep range.
Yeah, it's pretty much what most like successful bodybuilders do. If we give the example of like Lachlan Gannon, let's say, who I think is, he's like a marathon runner from Ireland. But no, Lach, like he's an interesting person, because he actually puts into practice, and has for a long time, a lot of the things that people in, let's say, the evidence-based community will come out and say, oh, look at this new research. And like, I'm all for that. Like, I'm all for us being like, yeah, let's see what the research says. But I also think it's important for us to not get too detached from practice, in that like you have to also look at like what are people actually doing. Not to say that is high in the hierarchy of evidence, but you see a lot of people like Locke who will have periods of time where they work in like really high repetition ranges, doing more overall volume, and then he'll have like a strength phase, and then he'll have a moderate repetition phase. And like that's what I've gathered from watching his training over the years. He'll have periods of time where he does really slow eccentrics and concentrics. Again, it's just like you could break this down to a simple heuristic of vary your training over time, full stop, and you'd essentially get to all of the answers that are in the scientific research now. So it's nice to marry those two things, and to use that to guide your training to some degree. So yeah, there you go.
And he's big, so obviously he knows what he's doing.
Well, obviously that's all that matters. Next question is different to the others, but patellar tendinopathy. Haven't returned to training and have been resting to let it heal for 3 months. Still have some pain. Any recommendations? So essentially what this means, for people who don't know what a patellar tendinopathy is, it's essentially an injury to the tendon or ligament that connects the patella, your kneecap, to your tibial tuberosity, which is that little bumpy little nodule at the top of your tibia.
I take offense to you saying little, because that's
little.
That's problematic.
Paddy's is like a sword because he had Osgood Schlatters. So
You say had. I have. Fucking Oscar Slatter's disease as well, I'll have you know.
I just like to leave out the disease.
No, you can't leave it there. I have to tell people I have a disease. I actually have two. I have two diseases.
Vikings disease.
Viking disease, yeah. But yeah, go on. Actually, I'm going to go pee while you talk about this
You
because
go ahead.
I have nothing to add except for maybe something at the end.
All right. Well, yeah. So, like, very simply, that's essentially what we're talking about here. We're talking about some sort of insult slash injury to that area of the body, that tendon or ligament, depending on who your anatomy teacher is. You know, it is technically kind of the patellar ligament because essentially what you're looking at is a bone to bone connection between the patella and the tibial tuberosity. But where that essentially comes from, that is essentially the quadriceps tendon. Okay, so that whole quadriceps tendon is running from your quadriceps muscles at the front of the thigh to the patella and then to the tibial tuberosity. So that's what we're talking about here. And this isn't an uncommon injury by any means, but one of the things that comes up a lot of the time when we talk about tendinopathy is that people tend to assume that rest is good. Okay, and that's kind of one of the messages we get when it comes to a lot of pain conditions is that, oh, I'll just rest and see how it fares, you know. But that's not what we tend to advise when it comes to tendinopathy. So when it comes to tendinopathy, tendons love load. Okay, so generally one of the kind of primary areas of intervention or treatment when it comes to tendinopathy is going to be progressive loading of some sort. So that might start with, you know, basic, like really light resistance training. It could be something as simple as, you know, a half squat, let's say, and eventually getting to, at the end stage, kind of more, let's say, sport specific stuff if someone was involved in sport, or plyometric stuff where, let's say, you're jumping and hopping and you're applying that kind of stretch shortening cycle or that kind of explosive plyometric load to the tendon. Okay, so it has to really store and release energy because that's one of the things tendons are good at. So that's essentially where we get to at the end point. But tendons really do like load, so it's important to load them even though there might be a little bit of pain. So that's something that tends to deter people. There you go. If you're watching the video, you can see Paddy's tibial tuberosity and the lack of gastrocnemius. But he may not have calves, but he does have feelings, so I apologize. But anyway, so yeah, that is one of the things you're going to experience is that there is probably going to be some pain when you load the tendon. There are some ways you can modify that, but I would just say that it generally, like, from even like from a research perspective, this has been studied, and you're not going to have adverse outcomes just because you load the tendon with some pain. In general, like I don't really like pain scales that much, but if I had to give someone advice, I would say, firstly, load as tolerated. Secondly, like if you want a more specific number that works better for you, like 3 to 4 out of 10, 10 being the worst pain you could possibly experience, is what a lot of people advise. You know, there's differing perspectives on the use of pain scales. I don't think they're that useful, but take it for what you will. This is generalized podcast stuff. So yeah, you do need to load it. There might be a little bit of pain, and that is okay. And generally what you're looking for is some degree of quadriceps loading. So you're trying to load the knee, which could be something like it depends on what you were doing in the past. Like if you're coming from this from a resistance training perspective, then exercises like leg extensions, squat variations, leg press variations can all be useful. Generally, I quite like leg extensions just because, or knee extensions, whatever you want to call them, just because, like, you know what you're doing, you know, as in it's there is nothing else that can move that load except for your quad. So I quite like that from a specificity perspective, and also because generally in the presence of pain, it can be nice to know that you have a lot of control over the exercise. You know, let's say if you're doing a barbell squat and you get down to the bottom, and let's say you happen to like freak out and shift to one side, you don't want to have that risk of, let's say, the barbell falling off your back. Just thinking big picture here. So a leg extension can be nice. Squat variations can still be quite good, but you may need to, let's say, adjust the load initially. You could start off with, let's say, 50% of the weight that you would normally use, control the tempo a little bit more, work, you know, 3 to 4 reps from failure, and start there and kind of build up over time as tolerated. The reason I say control the tempo a bit more is because generally tendons, as we discussed a minute ago, they tend to be responsible for that kind of, energy storage and release. So what you might find is that if you abruptly come to the bottom and you kind of spike up out of the hole, when people kind of dive bomb their squats, you might find that you get a bit of pain there. But if you're able to control it a little bit more, control the change of direction, you might find that actually allows you to train quite effectively. So again, it can be useful training modification. But yeah, essentially what we're saying is that apply some load as tolerated, start with a small dose, try and progress it over time. Don't be afraid if there's a little bit of pain, and just recognize that load is actually advisable here, and that you don't actually have to wait for anything to quote unquote heal. Okay, because one of the things we tend to see in tendon research is that sometimes what you actually see in quote unquote pathological tendons is that they actually have more healthy tissue despite having some tissue that has pathological changes. So it's not about letting something heal. It's about you building up your capacity for load again. So yeah, that's most of what you need to know.
Yeah, and as someone who has had essentially patellar tendinopathy, like the thing that I found most beneficial was slowly loading that squat pattern, but with a lot of forward knee tracking. Basically using a very, very controlled eccentric and concentric. Like I essentially just did it on a slant board,
Yeah.
and really got that patella tendon to stretch under load and just control that movement. Now, obviously, you have to slowly progress that. Like, you don't just go, oh, I'm going to go for a slant board squat here, and I'm going to load up my max squat as well. Like, that's obviously not what we're talking about. But like, I found that very beneficial to. This is actually how I started really to begin thinking about like exercise mechanics more than just like, oh, squat for big legs. Like I was like, well, why does my knee hurt? Like that kind of stuff. So doing that on a slant board, getting a lot of forward knee movement so that the patellar tendon is in that kind of stretched position, and just slowly loading that up. So something like a slant board squat, like a goblet squat, probably be easier to load than trying to do with a barbell as well. And just slowly, you could even do single leg and not go like the full way down, like get kind of a little bit of a Peterson step up type deal going on. So you're getting that kind of terminal knee extension. But that may not as beneficial for this person here. But I did find getting that stretch position, slowly progressing that under load, that resulted in the quickest reduction of pain and the quickest reintroduction of function. So yeah, I completely endorse getting that knee forward and progressing it, getting stronger there.
Yeah, and like basically what you said is essentially what a lot of physios try to do. Like that kind of slant board incline squat is like one of the things that some people use as like a diagnostic tool. In that, like, if you want to find out if someone has a patellar tendinopathy, put them on that, see how it feels. Is the pain like specific to that area? And because, like you said, there's so much load in that area, you tend to find that their symptoms will be reproduced there. And also, it's kind of one of the exercises that people use as a gold standard, in that, like, oh, we want to get you really strong in this incline squat, which again, like you said, goes back to a lot of the exercise mechanics stuff we talk about, and the parallels between rehab and training that a lot of people don't draw. In that, like, you have physios talking about like, oh, an incline squat for patellar tendinopathy, and because it loads the knee and it helps to get the knee really strong because it's more specific. But then you could also have the same physios who will say, don't let your knees go over your toes, even though they're using it purposefully in that case. So it's interesting to think about how those things might relate. But yeah, the next part, or the next question rather, setting up training.
Let's do that one last because it's a longer question.
Yeah, true. As next question, we've probably touched on some points that are relevant to this, but the next question was, can you grow muscle in a calorie deficit? What's the deal? Deficit, lose all your gains, or can you gain some muscle?
Yeah, so like when you think of a calorie deficit, like traditionally what people are thinking of is losing body fat, right? Because that's generally what it's couched as. It's like, dude, eat less food, move more, and you'll lose body fat, right? But most people just kind of forget the discussion around what happens to your muscle, unless you're actually in the health and fitness world and you actually, care about your resistance training, you're maybe a bodybuilder or whatever. But in terms of the general population, the wider population, most people just look at a calorie deficit and look at like, is my scale weight going down, right? Like they actually don't really care if their muscle mass is going down, right? That's the vast majority of people. Like if you ask your mother, your father, your granny, your granddad, or whatever, like if you eat less, what happens? They're like, oh yeah, your scale weight goes down. Like they have no concept of like muscle mass. They just basically think of it in terms of your scale weight going down if you're in a calorie deficit, right? But once you start getting into this kind of stuff, you start reading more and start going, okay, actually, wait, preservation of muscle mass while dieting is a pretty good idea in terms of health, but also in terms of the aesthetic qualities of your physique that you're probably trying to present by dieting. You know, like you want to look jacked on the beach or whatever. You know, so that discussion starts a further discussion of, okay, well, I'm starting in this position. I'm kind of skinny fat. You know, I don't have a huge amount of muscle and I have fat to lose. So can I grow muscle in a deficit? So you may be coming to it from that perspective as a beginner. And then you may be also coming to it from the perspective of, I really like my training, but I also have a summer holiday coming up or whatever, and I wouldn't mind being leaner for it, you know? So we have the person who is a beginner, and then we also have the person that's maybe intermediate to even advanced, right? So for the beginner, oh fuck yeah, you can grow muscle in a deficit. Easy, no problem at all. Like just training itself, you know, it's a potent anabolic stimulus, so potent that you're just going to be able to grow muscle. It's not going to be an issue for you, right? You know, now is it optimal to be in a deficit and trying to build muscle? No, probably not. Actually, definitely not. You know, as a beginner, right? Now, basically, as a beginner, anything will work. So this question, it's kind of irrelevant. You know, like as long as you're not in, I don't know, a 2,000 calorie deficit, like a ridiculous deficit, it kind of doesn't matter. Now, if you're intermediate or advanced, growing muscle in a deficit, certainly possible. Is it likely? Not really. You know, that's not to say that, you know, you can't do it. And this is especially true if you effectively make yourself a beginner. And what I mean by that is, you know, maybe you've been doing a lot of chest work, a lot of back work, a lot of leg work, and then you start dieting and you notice, oh, my shoulders aren't actually as big as I thought they were. So I'm going to do a lot more lateral raises, for example. I'm just going to add them into my program. And you're effectively a beginner shoulder trainee, you know? Is it more likely that you're going to grow muscle in those areas? Yeah, it's more likely because you haven't trained them before. So there's a bigger potential there for growth, right? But if you've set your training up so that you're basically hitting all muscle groups effectively throughout your, say, off season or your gaining phase, muscle growth while dieting, not really likely. You may get a small amount of muscle growth, especially if you're like kind of intermediate, you know, maybe a couple of 100 grams here and there, you know, something noticeable, but not like physique changing. But it's just way less likely than if you were a beginner. And this again comes to the conversation of people trying to do this kind of body recomposition. It's 100% possible, you know, where you basically lose fat and you gain muscle. It's just the least time effective way of going about things, you know, unless you are a beginner. Now that's the kind of intermediate person. If you're advanced, you're probably not going to gain any muscle if you're dieting, you know, you're just not, unfortunately, you know. Again, you might be in the case of the intermediate where you're kind of like, oh, actually, you know, I haven't paid as much attention to my rear delts. I wouldn't mind just dialing a little bit of we're putting a little bit of tension onto those, and then you get a small bit of growth. But if you're kind of more advanced, you know, you probably kind of maxed out your muscle growth, or maybe you have a couple more kilos in you, but you're not really going to grow that in a deficit. Now, this is all assuming that you have been doing most things right all along. You know, if you are eating a low protein diet and yeah, you're in a surplus, and then you go, oh fuck it, actually, I'm gonna start dieting, and all of a sudden you reach this adequate or more protein in your diet. Is growth more likely, even if you're advanced? Yeah, 100%. You're actually giving another stimulus that you have been holding out on. The protein itself is a stimulus. Yeah, it's more likely then. But again, if you're doing everything pretty much right and you're like, oh, I'm going to start dieting, can I grow muscle in a deficit? For a beginner, yeah. Intermediate, yeah, just unlikely. Advanced, yeah, just really unlikely.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that happens a lot of the time when people report this is that they are coming from a position where they had lots of unchecked boxes. And this is especially true of kind of like the people you tend to see on Instagram who have like a yearly transformation, because a lot of the people that you look at, they're like, we talked about this especially in relation to some females in particular. It's kind of like you're either on or you're off. As in, like, the only time you kind of train and manage your nutrition is when you're trying to lose weight. That's one of the problems a lot of people kind of run into, is that they only ever really tick all the boxes when they're dieting, and otherwise it's just like, yeah, I'll just kind of do whatever, because like it's only about getting lean anyway. So there you go. And so that happens to a lot of people. The bodybuilders in their off season are actually particularly guilty of this as well. Like, they'll go into their off season, and what they'll do is they'll like turn themselves into like pseudo powerlifters where they just do like squat, bench, deadlift, and they just kind of they're a bit lackadaisy about when they eat. They just kind of eat whatever. I'm just bulking. Like, all that matters is the scales go up. They potentially go out more alcohol, which is, a catabolic. You go out more and lose sleep, again, catabolic. So you essentially take away all the things that you were doing well, and then when you get back into your deficit, to your dieting, it's like 100% focus, sleeping enough, not drinking anymore, making better food choices, eating more protein, etc. Training more like someone who's trying to build muscle, and you can have hypertrophy in that case. So that's worth considering when you see those reports. And I suppose on the other side of that coin, then a lot of people say that it's just impossible, that it's all about being in a calorie surplus, and some of that comes from a good place, in a sense, in that, like, you can actually go into the research and read some studies where people lose muscle. Lean mass is essentially what they're looking at, lean body mass, and you can interpret that as being like pure muscle loss, whereas what you might actually be seeing is reductions in water weight that come with dieting, reductions in muscle glycogen, or reductions in the non-fat component of adipose tissue, because that also adds up. So if you get a DEXA scan and you've lost body fat, by virtue of losing body fat, you are going to have less lean body mass. So you can't just interpret that as being muscle loss. So that's one of the reasons some people overestimate this. But there's plenty of studies that show people gaining muscle in a deficit, even as high as like a 40% calorie deficit, which is pretty large. That's a pretty significant deficit. And people still tend to gain muscle once you are resistance training and eating a high protein diet. So yeah, possible, but less possible and suboptimal when you're at the more advanced stage, for sure.
Yeah, it's also a real weird one, because like there are really weird situations where you put such a demand on your body that you have to build muscle and effectively tap into any energy stores. Like, there's that guy, I think it's the Iron Cowboy. He ran like fucking 50 marathons in 50 days or some fucking crazy shit like that. Anyway, he got his body fat and DEXA and all that kind of shit done, and like he got down to like 4% body fat by the end of it all, right? He'd literally eaten through all of his body fat stores, but his lean mass went up, because he was putting himself under such a demand from running for so much. Like, he was like, my legs got jacked, but this also then comes to the or answers the question is like, oh, can you build muscle from cardio? And it's like, yeah, you can. It's just, again, it goes back to that kind of effective reps that we were talking about. To get the effective reps from cardio, you're probably going to have to fucking run multiple marathons. So that you can build muscle in a deficit. It's just highly unlikely.
Yes, sir. And then finally, probably one of the longer questions, but setting up training for females, what should be considered? The context of this question was kind of like if you want to add the additional context, general population clients with generalist goals, and that was asked on Instagram, I believe. But yeah, there you go.
I actually don't think there's a huge difference in terms of how you would set it up for males and females in terms of overall volume. Like, some females, like, I hate generalizing this kind of stuff, because some females seem to be able to handle way more volume, that could just be a function of them being weaker, because that's generally what you'll find for everyone. Like if you're weaker, you're able to handle more volume. Whereas if you're stronger, you're able to handle less volume, which is kind of counterintuitive to what you might think, being like, well, I got stronger, so I have to do more volume to keep progressing. It's like, no, like you do a heavy set of squats, 4 heavy sets of squats, like that might be enough for you to continue growing, because you are so far advanced. Like if you're doing 4 sets of 8 200-kilo squats, it's like that's a pretty big trigger to for your body to grow, whereas 4 sets of 8 squats at 80 kilos is a trigger to grow, but it's not as metabolically or neurologically disrupting as the 200 kilos, so generally you will find women tend to be able to handle a little bit more volume. That doesn't mean you have to give them more volume, but other than that, the only things that are going to really change in terms of training a female is maybe putting more emphasis on the glutes. Again, we're obviously generalizing here, but more emphasis on the glutes because that's generally what they want. Maybe a little bit less emphasis on the quads, because some females don't like having bigger quads. Some do, yourself. Maybe putting a little bit less emphasis on the chest and a bit more on the shoulders. But then again, some females don't like that kind of more, we'll say, quote unquote, masculine shoulder look, And other than that, generally people say like, oh, you should focus more on the upper fibers of the chest, the clavicular portion of the chest, if you're training females. But even that, I'm kind of like, I don't know if it makes this huge difference. Like, yes, we do want to potentially buy a stat, especially if you are a female who wants to compete, because generally what you'll see is, well, first of all, they pretty much all have fake boobs. So if you're going to compete, that's almost a mandatory. It is what it is. That's the sport. But also what you'll see is they tend to have the upper ribs showing. And that, depending on the federation, depending on who you're competing with, like that kind of gets marked down a little bit because they want to see some muscularity of the upper chest. And also generally women don't want to see their ribs poking through their upper chest. It doesn't allow them to wear tops like that would have like, a bigger loop in the neck, So you could argue that training the upper chest a little bit more is going to be beneficial for females. But then I also just think, I'm like, man, if you train in any way effectively for the pec major as a whole, like you're going to stimulate the upper fibers, like you do a bench press and like you have an arch, you're basically getting as much fiber recruitment as you could possibly want, so I just don't think there's a huge difference in terms of how you would set training up for a male or a female, apart from maybe choosing different exercises, maybe choosing more glute focused exercises. But in terms of volume, that kind of stuff, I'm like, it comes down to that kind of individualized experience, like maybe you do more volume for the glutes because that's what you want to really focus on. But also I just think a lot of people just do a load of junk volume just for the sake of doing it, be like, oh, I got a really good glute pump. Like as we said earlier on, it's like, yeah, like that might contribute this small amount to growth or the overall training experience, but like, is it making a huge difference? Probably not. Like getting stronger in a glute bridge, a hip thrust, a squat, a deadlift, like that's going to grow your glutes. You don't need to be doing like 20 sets of glute kickbacks to get this mild pump that lasts half an hour, but then you don't get any actual growth,
Yes, sir. And I think in the actual question again, like one of the caveats that was added was like, should we consider anything about the menstrual cycle? And like, obviously, like you've written about that on site. And I think like there's theoretical arguments to be made for sure. But I think some of them can wash out in the real world, in that like if someone was just signing up with us for coaching, I'd much rather see someone get consistent with training and do something consistently over time than to have them worrying about periodizing their volume based on their periodizing. There you go. It comes up every time we talk about this.
It's awful. No.
You did this in your article, so I'm like, I don't care.
That was funny when I did it. It's not funny when you do
it. But yeah, essentially,
on that stuff as well, like periodizing the training around the menstrual cycle. Like, yes, you could argue theoretically, and I actually think there is research to support it.
Yeah.
To dialing it into your cycle. But again, this just becomes down to an individualized training experience then, because like most women, like although we always say, oh, 28-day cycle, it's like most women just don't have that, you know? So how are you going to periodize your training cycle if your cycle isn't consistent? You know, like, are you just going to be like, right, we're going to keep training until we know you're a week before your period or whatever? It's like, this is not practical unless you have a very consistent, very regular cycle, you know? And I would much rather just tweak training as the weeks go. Like if you know that, okay, every week before I have my period, my performance increases, because that happens for some people, or maybe your performance decreases. You know, maybe the week of your cycle or of your period, you know, you're kind of like, oh, like I just feel like crap. I can't lift heavy. I just have no motivation. It's like, okay, well then, like, I would like to adjust it based on that feedback. I don't think you can make generalized recommendations. Like obviously you can. I just don't think they're more effective than just the generalized recommendations. You know?
Yeah, and I think this is one of the reasons it's so important to, like, when you get interested in theory, you have to also stay in practice. Because I remember like the first time reading about all this menstrual cycle stuff, being like, this is the secret, you know, this is going to change the way I program for people. But then like looking at, let's say, my current like female clients, you know, I could think of like most of them don't have this magic 28-day cycle. Like it's like, yeah, that's the average. Like that's the thing that, you know, you put down as like, this is the mean. But like, what's the standard deviation there? You know, there's a couple of females who have, you know, like 35 to 40 day cycles, but that's been through their whole life, and that's essentially their norm at this point in time. So again, it's like how exactly do you change it for every individual? I'm not sure you can. Like there are some clients of mine who find that, God, their appetite is just reckless on that week before their period. Their mood is lower. They have, you know, decrements in training performance. And for them, more specific advice. But again, that can then change throughout the year again then, because what you're obviously going to have is like, as you change your energy status, whether you're dieting or gaining weight or you're playing sport or whatever, that can then affect the menstrual cycle as well, and potentially the hormonal underpinnings that would be the theoretical basis for these changes in training anyway. So it's really easy when you're looking at a simple graph that, you know, all right, we're probably going to gain more muscle in the first half of the phase than the second half of the phase. But once it gets into an individual level, I would be more concerned with programming based on what client feedback is. You know, if you feel best for the first 3 weeks and feel a bit crap on the fourth week, I'm happy to have a 3-to-1 kind of hard training to a little bit lower volume, a little bit lower intensity paradigm. But again, that's why coaching needs to be individual. So that's most of it, I guess.
Yeah, like there's so many theoretical conclusions you could come to,
Yeah,
you know, especially around the cardiovascular stuff and the
yeah,
strength or the performance stuff. Like if you're just looking to build muscle and lose fat, it basically doesn't matter. You know, like it's kind of irrelevant. You know, like it's pretty easy to, even if you feel like shit, you know, push out a set of 8. You know, it's not too neurologically demanding. It's not too metabolically demanding. Like, yeah, you might notice your strength is a little bit lower, but it's still going to be an effective training session overall. So I just don't think it matters too much. However, if you are talking about like sporting performance, or you are like a power lifter, or I don't know, you're doing a lot of cardio or something, then yeah, maybe we could argue a bit more that we need to be a bit more on top of things with this stuff, because, you know, certain times of the cycle, you're going to be like, yeah, my anaerobic performance is fucking on fire. You know, certain times your aerobic capacity is going to be unreal. Certain times, you know, your strength is going to be at an all-time high. You feel great. So you have to kind of take that into account, especially if you are competing, because like, there's not much you can do if, you know, you notice on your third week, you feel like absolute fucking crap. And that's the week of your competition. You know, so
yeah,
you're going to have to go into things with that training, and then do stuff in your training cycle to try to combat that in whatever way possible. You know, maybe it is that you need to warm up longer. Maybe it is that you need to get more hyped up. Maybe it is that you need to relax more. You know, you need to kind of iron out these details if you are going to be competing and you are regularly cycling female. The other side of the coin is most people that are competing are not regularly cycling females because they are pushing their bodies really hard, you know? And this is the thing, like we're talking about just the menstrual cycle in general, there's a certain set of recommendations. If we're talking about amenorrhea, especially if it's caused by secondary amenorrhea, like especially if it's caused by a lack of energy availability overall, like that's a different conversation we need to have. Like generally you're going to see these people that are absolutely hammering themselves with training and they're on low calories, and effectively it comes down to bringing calories back up to an adequate level and bringing training volume down to an adequate level. You know, if that's the case, then obviously how we set things up is going to be completely different than if we had someone that's like, yeah, I'm generally healthy. But again, this comes down to like, you're effectively a quote unquote diseased population. You know, like that's a specific population if you have amenorrhea, you know, so you have to do this like that specific population. Like you wouldn't just go, this person that had patellar tendinopathy, you wouldn't just be like, all right, here's my general recommendations for a healthy individual with regard to leg training. Just jump into that. You know, like you wouldn't say that. You know, you're like, okay, well, there's some extra considerations we need to have with you as an individual. And that's the same with amenorrhea.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, because very often what people do is they extrapolate from populations that you could almost consider to have some sort of pathology and just apply it to everyone. Like another good example is like reverse dieting. You know, like we might say to people that, oh yeah, you know, when you're coming out of a dieting phase, just add calories like slowly, you know, take your time, it's totally fine. For me right now, let's say, that'd be perfectly appropriate advice. For someone who's been a competitive bodybuilder and they've gotten down to, let's say, 5-6% body fat, probably wouldn't be the best advice, because you want to get to a higher level of energy much quicker. You want to get to at least maintenance pretty much right away, because you are like technically, and you can observe this in a lot of bodybuilders, it's almost a pathology. You know, you are pretty much putting yourself in some sort of pathological state, like psychologically for sure for a lot of people, and also physiologically, in that your body is in extreme state and there are very real physiological changes that come with that. So if you then apply that logic of like taking it from, you know, someone who it might be a good idea to just add in 100 calories and apply that to the bodybuilder, not a good situation. So again, context definitely matters.
100%, Gary. Anyway, that's all our questions for today.
Yep, and we finished on that kind of menstrual cycle female specific question. And when we asked for questions, another message that came in was that we need a specific podcast on like the menstrual cycle female stuff. So we will definitely do that, but I think our plan is probably to have a guest and we'll all discuss that. Is that correct? What do you think?
Yeah, I'm thinking that myself too. Although we might do an intro episode, intro episode, cover a lot of shit, and then have a guest.
That'd be good.
But yeah, do you have anything else to add?
I guess all I'd add really is that, like, if you've never heard of the menstrual cycle, you know, a lot of guys are actually even some women as well. Some people are totally ignorant to the fact that there is this cycle and what goes on. And I think like understanding the basics of it is probably useful. You know, even if you're a guy and you're in a relationship with a female, might be worthwhile information. It's also kind of a useful conversation starter if you're on a date. Like, just tell her loads of information about her cycle. I'm sure she'll love that. My mom's in the kitchen. She's like, oh yeah, do that. Yeah, like that's a really good move. Try that, she says. But yeah, you can essentially go to our website, read those articles that are on site, and that'll actually put you in a really good position to understand any specific podcast we then do on that topic. So yeah, there you go.
Well, I have nothing else to add except we do still have coaching spaces available, and we do still have, obviously, because it's unlimited, we do still have ebooks available, the beginner ebook. We're actually working on a few other ones because there is a demand, like people have been asking for certain things, and they're easy for us to put out. We're going to make some like templates for training programs and stuff, because like obviously we talk a lot about the theory and training theory, nutrition theory, and all that kind of stuff, but like we're kind of doing with the vlogging as well, like having the practical application, like actually seeing it in practice, seeing how these things would actually play out, does allow you to understand things to a much greater degree, you know, because it's all good. You basically don't want to go either side of that. You don't want to be just all evidential experience, or not evidential. You don't want to be all just like, oh, this is my experience, this is what I've seen. You know, it's like you don't want that. And you also don't want to be the other thing where it's like, oh, well, I read this in a book. It's like you have no real world practicality, So you want to get, obviously, marry those two things, and seeing us do it in the vlogs and stuff obviously helps, but then also seeing it in a book, like an ebook format, a template that would be like, this is how we would consider training for this goal, or training with this many days available, that kind of stuff. Like actually seeing it in a practical manner does help people with their overall understanding of a topic, but also it gives them a plan of action. So it'll kind of be for the two people. Like if you are a coach, you are training people, having an understanding of, okay, so this is how I would set up training if a person came to me and they had X goal, or it's also and it's also for the individual that's like, I want to train 3 days per week. That's all I have available to me. This is my goal. Where would we start that person? That's what we want to kind of provide with all those books. But at the moment, we do have the beginner's ebook. And as we said before, even though it's called the beginner's ebook, it's not necessarily just for beginners. It's also for people that are more advanced, because again, most people come to this stuff and they learn bits and pieces mainly from social media these days, and they don't actually ever get I'll say proper education. I wouldn't even say the ebook is a proper education, but they don't ever get a sequential education. Like they don't actually understand the underlying principles. They don't understand the orders of importance. They don't get, the basics. So even if you are more advanced, reading the ebook, the beginner's ebook, does really help solidify the thoughts that you've had, and it also obviously helps you if you are training beginners, so you can kind of go, oh, okay, so that's how I would set things up, Anyway, Gary, do you have anything else to add?
If you're trying to keep up with all this stuff and you're not, on Instagram every day scrolling through the Triage Method page, it's highly recommended that you sign up to our email list. We won't send you any spam. 1 email per week, just letting you know everything we've shared, so you can catch up on it with your Sunday morning coffee. And also, like, any additional resources we found across the internet, or books or whatever that we think might be useful or of interest, we'll add those in there as well. And then all those will be on site as well. So, keep up.
You also get a 10% discount in store.
Yeah.
If you sign up to the email list, which is quite nice. Well, I think it's quite nice, but maybe I'm biased.
Yep. There you go.
Yeah, I have nothing else to add except, Gary, you're supposed to start vlogging now, aren't you?
Yeah, so I'll have a video blog up this week as well.
You saw video blogs. It's so like 1990s.
I know, I keep doing it like deliberately though, because I'm like, oh, I don't want to be like, hey, look at my vlog. So I just want to remind people that that's actually what it stands for. So my video blog. But yeah, subscribe to our YouTube channel. We'll have that up there. And, not just vlogs, we're also going to be doing some additional kind of more specific topics that we'll cover there, because essentially we just want to have a diverse range of sources that you guys can check out: audio, video, text, and choose your preference.
Yeah, because that's kind of what we want to provide over the next while. Is like, I understand, like, I know I like reading, I know you like reading, Gary, but I also know that a lot of people don't like reading. So I want to be able to help as many people as possible. So that's what we're going to start doing with the YouTube channel as well. So if you want to subscribe, putting out more kind of content in terms of answering questions in a video format, So like Gary was saying earlier on, we're kind of moving off Instagram. Well, I basically don't really use Instagram except to look at memes. But Gary's kind of moving off Instagram, and we're kind of just get questions maybe from Instagram, maybe from the online form, whatever, email even, and then answer them in an actual video, because that's able to help way more people than just an Instagram DM. And while we obviously do want to help as many individual people as possible, as we said before at the start of this episode, like, answering a question to you in a DM and going into the nitty-gritty is great. Love helping individuals. But also, that information could probably have helped 20, 30, 50, 100, 200, 500 people, and it's effectively lost to that one person, Yeah. And that obviously does help that one person, and that's ultimately what we're trying to do. But it makes more sense from our larger goal, our larger kind of picture, our ethos, or whatever you want to call it, of helping as many people as possible, to actually put that content out in an easy to understand and consume format, you know?
Yes, sir.
Anyway, I have
And
nothing
that's
else
it.
to add.
It's too easy.
It literally is.